Para dar início, então, a essa nossa sessão de perguntas e respostas.
So to start this Q&A session, I will start asking the questions, just reminding you that you can ask questions online. You can send comments and I can read it here.
Website, and I can read it here. Minha primeira pergunta, ela vai ter que ser introduzida.
My first question, I need to give an introduction with the thought of Israel Kirzner. He says that subjectivism teaches, just like Hayek, that for the economy it doesn't matter what the things are, but what the agents think that they are. When dealing with the economy of knowledge, therefore, we should analyze not knowledge, but what the agents know about knowledge. But the subjectivist economy, and especially the entrepreneurial action derived from the notion of action, leads, on the contrary, to the importance of knowledge, over which man know nothing in absolute. In other terms, Kirzner tries to share the notions of subjective knowledge and subjacent realities that exist regardless of that subjective knowledge. In one of his books, he states, we have an implicit paradox in the concept of knowledge, that we have to know what we want to know before we start to research. But there are things that we should know, about we don't know that we should know, that continue to be unknown and not solved. So my question to the speakers, in summary, there are things that we don't know that we don't know, but that we should, through science, search for them. Considering Ayn Rand's philosophy expressed in our previous presentation, that facts are facts, how did we evolve through science in the search for things that we don't know that we don't know? I'm sorry if that was too complex.
I mean, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm not sure I understand the point that Kirzner is that who it is making, because the whole history of science is a process of discovering things we didn't know. I mean, when Galileo turned his telescope to the sky, he had no idea what he would see up there. He discovered that Jupiter has moons. I mean, nobody knew that Jupiter has moons. You know, he discovered that Venus has phases like the moon. It goes through cycles. And so the whole history of science is pushing the boundaries of things we never even knew were out there. So, I mean, Ayn Rand's perspective is on scientific discovery, and she has a very deep metaphysical perspective called the primacy of existence, and it's the idea that reality is the way it is. You know, it's out there, and the role of reason and the role of scientific discovery is to learn what's out there, and humanity starts out in a state of total ignorance. You know, when we're primitive man living in caves, you know, hunting for food, we don't know anything, and we make up stories to try to give ourselves a worldview and answer questions. You know, why do the trees shake? Well, they're wind gods. And why do the rivers flow? They're river gods. And the whole process of developing science and developing civilization is discovering the way the world actually is, not just the way we think it is. And even with entrepreneurialism, I don't think it's true that entrepreneurs have to start out already knowing, you know, what they're trying to figure out. You know, some of the most innovative creations happen because somebody has an idea that nobody ever thought of and everybody thinks is crazy, and then that becomes a world-changing idea. So, well, okay, so Onkar's, so recently there was discovery in gravitational physics where they discovered gravitational waves for the first time. So these are waves of energy that Albert Einstein predicted. I wasn't actually going to go into this, but this is my background. I have a PhD in physics, and this is what I studied. So, and for decades, they were building these gravitational wave detectors, and just in the last couple of years, they finally were actually able to detect something for the first time. They're collisions of black holes and that sort of thing. And one of the founders of this project, what he always said was, you know, there are certain things we expect to see. So we do all our calculations, and we have good reasons for building the detectors, and we have good reasons for thinking that we're going to be able to detect black hole collisions and all that sort of thing. But the thing he always said that he was most excited about was the things we have no idea are out there in the universe. You know, he's most excited about the things we don't know and pushing the boundaries by making totally new discoveries. So.
Ele tinha fé, então, que ele encontraria algo a mais? Ele teria fé que ele encontraria algo a mais?
So no, he didn't expect that he definitely would find something. He had exactly the proper attitude, which is, you know, our human knowledge, there's always a certain context of knowledge that we have. So there are things that we know, and there are things that we don't know, and there are things that we don't know that we don't know. And the things that you don't know, you can't have any expectations about it. But I think what he had was curiosity and hope that maybe we would discover something we never knew about. But even if we don't, there were good enough reasons based on the things that we did know and that we did expect to find to justify building these detectors. And just in the last couple of years, I mean, it's been amazing what we've discovered about these things. And I don't think we've discovered yet anything that we didn't know, but, you know, we can keep trying, so.
Nós estamos abertos a perguntas.
We are open for questions.
A minha pergunta seria...
My question is, every theory, usually there are some criticisms to it from some other specialists or other currents of thought. I would like to know if each one of you, if you have some criticism regarding Ayn Rand's theory, and if you could talk about this criticism.
Well, I've got 7 of them. No. It's in a way it's a kind of a strange question to answer, because obviously the reason that I'm speaking here today is because I've studied the objectivist philosophy for many years, going on about 25 years that I've studied it, and you know, at a certain point, when you study one philosophy and you compare it to the many other philosophies that you study in college and then in graduate school, and I spent too long time in graduate school, you start to get a sense of what the essential issues are, and you realize that you agree with one philosophy in its essential fundamental terms, and so you consider yourself to be a subscriber to that philosophy. And I certainly think that is not a perspective that one adopts overnight, not properly, not if one's approaching it with intellectual honesty. I know people, I have known people who jump into their study of not just Ayn Rand, but many other philosophers, and they immerse themselves in it, and they become overnight converts. And I think properly one shouldn't do that. One should carefully study a philosophy and ask lots of critical questions about it, and really struggle with oneself and consider all of the criticisms that have been made about it. And one of the things that I did when I first started to study objectivism was I went to the library and I tried to find as many books as I could that offered criticisms of it. And there weren't many at the time. There were a few in the the mid-90s when I was looking at objectivism for the first time. But I read them and I struggled with them, and I was sympathetic to some of the criticisms. But in my case, at least, the more that I studied the philosophy, the more certainty I acquired that it was the right one. And so I don't have today any fundamental criticisms of the philosophy. That doesn't mean I agree with Ayn Rand, everything she ever said on every topic. There's a difference between her philosophy, which is the essential principles of her worldview. There's a difference between that and everything she ever said. So I don't necessarily agree with everything she ever said. And I don't keep a list with me of all the things that I might disagree with. But the important question is, what do you think about the philosophy? And I've had criticisms of it in the past that I think at least answered for myself, and that's why I consider myself an objectivist today. And I don't expect that everybody here considers themselves an objectivist, and that's fine, and we can have an interesting conversation, I think, because of that. You want to add anything?
I think there's also if you think of philosophy as a science, you don't have this question about things in science. You don't say, if you agree with Newton's theory of gravity, are you a Newtonist or something? Or if you think Einstein had important things to say about gravity, do you believe everything Einstein had to say about gravity? It's an issue of there's a perspective on the world, and the question is, do you think it's true or not? And it's a scientific question. It's a question about whether the concepts and ideas that you come up with are in accordance with the facts, just the same way that you would have with respect to gravity or scientific issues. So.
And I'll add. Can you hear me? Okay. Two additional things. So I definitely agree with what Ben said. Not everything that Ayn Rand said is part of her philosophy. A philosophy is a theory about the fundamentals of reality in man's relationship to reality. And every philosophy, whether you're talking about Plato's or Aristotle's or Immanuel Kant's or Ayn Rand's, is a theory about a certain set of issues and questions. And it's delimited. So Aristotle said many things that are not part of his philosophy, and same with Ayn Rand. But there's also an issue of the application of philosophical principles to particular issues. And you might disagree with the application that she makes of the principles to a specific area. That's not a disagreement at the level of principles. So there are things, I think, in terms of the philosophy, I agree with its principles. That doesn't mean I agree with every application Ayn Rand made of the principles. I'll give you one example. I agree with the principle. She has an article on racism in The Virtue of Selfishness. I agree with all the principles that are articulated there, they're metaphysical, ethical principles, and political principles. I don't agree with every specific application to them of the civil rights movement in the 60s that she's discussing. But to me, that is not an issue of disagreeing with the philosophy. It's a disagreement about the application of them. And she might be able to convince me that her application is right and mine's wrong. It's her philosophy, and I regard her as of an intellect at the level of a Plato and an Aristotle. So even when I disagree about applications, I often think, yeah, she might be able to convince me that I'm thinking about it wrong and her application is correct. The other thing to say, so to make a distinction between the principles and their application, and then make a distinction, there's other areas of knowledge. If she's talking about psychology or something, she's talking about psychology. That's not a philosophical issue. The other is to say that you agree with the principles of objectivism is not to say that Ayn Rand has dealt or answered every philosophical question and philosophical issue. So it's not to say that there's not more to explore and understand about philosophy. And she, to her death, was exploring philosophical issues. I think the two branches that are still the most to discover is epistemology and ethics, of the full principles of how to live a life of self-interest and happiness. And epistemology studies the principles of knowledge. And she was particularly interested in that, and at the end of her life she was thinking about epistemology, its relationship to mathematics, and if there's anything you can learn from neuroscience about epistemology. And if she lived another 10, 15 years, my guess is she would have discovered more principles that would have been issues in philosophy. So to say that you agree with her objectives is not to say philosophy is closed. And in regard to the science, and scientists will say it, we agree with Darwin's principles. So the essence of what Darwin discovered about evolution is true. He didn't discover everything about evolution. There's all kinds of new things to learn about evolutionary biology. But you can have both views. You can say, I agree with Darwin, and there's a lot more to discover. And that's my view in regard to Ayn Rand and philosophy.
Por favor.
First, I would like to thank you for the invitation from Roberto Rachevsky. When I asked him some questions about literature and liberal economy, and he said, go to this conference that we're going to learn a lot in this area. So I would like to thank Roberto and to thank all the lecturers that you have really brought renovation air for me in terms of education. I'm a doctor. I'm an educator as well. And in our medical pathway as a mature man, we have had pathways within ethics and reasoning. I'd like to mention a very important author for me, that it was Spinoza, a philosopher, a Jewish Portuguese philosopher that with the Inquisition he had to migrate to Amsterdam, and then he made there a revolution in the philosophical thinking against the establishment, especially the Jewish community in the 1600s. The issue is how to use the objectivism and the reason and ethics in today's world related to the point that I think it's critical for our world, which is the planet health and the global warming that is questioned by some people. I studied this situation, and I think there are very strong evidences that you have an anthropocentric effect of the global growing caused by the human being and the way the human being lives with others. I have seen the resume of some lecturers that Ken has a special interest in environment. So I would like to ask, what could we, even if you believe in the strong evidence of global warming, what could we do as attitudes in the greater scale, not only to be concerned with the Brazilian government, it's contradictory, but the North American government as well. He has retrieved from the Paris agreements, which is disasters. I have lived several years in Philadelphia, so how come that the United States arrived disconsidering all scientific evidence? I am a scientist besides being a doctor. How does it happen? What the objectivism could help us to change this government trend or government actions? Eu acho que o Keith tem algo a dizer sobre a pergunta da ciência do clima, mas eu não estava muito certo da conexão que existe na sua pergunta entre o Spinoza e a ciência do clima. Você pode esclarecer isso? Spinoza, it's a philosopher, as well known, that has questioned the establishment of the time, the main establishment, and he was a genius that succeeded in opening another pathway for philosophy, because the reason that is so valued by objectivists, he was a man that opened different pathways in ethics and reasoning. He was really...
About climate science. Yeah, I agree with your assessment of Spinoza. I don't agree with all of the principles of his philosophy, many of the details of his philosophy. But he was certainly a central figure in the Enlightenment, and especially important, I think, related to my earlier talk, in demanding justification, rational justification for religious views. And he wrote a whole book, the Theological Political Treatise, where he basically shows that we have no good reason to trust the testimony of ancient scripture, that it stands in our mind as hearsay. I think that's one of his best works, actually. His ethics is a different story. It's interesting because in advocating reason, he also ends up advocating a certain kind of rational egoism, but for very different reasons than Rand does offer, and he presents his whole treatise in a kind of geometrical, deductive form, which, as an approach to knowledge, is great for geometry. I don't think it works for ethics. I think ethics has to be much more inductively derived. That's the idea of making observations of the world around you and generalizing, and that's the basis of Rand's objectivist ethics. But even still, I think of Spinoza as a hero of the Enlightenment, and I have a lot of respect for him.
Okay, I'll say a little bit about global warming. So, I mean, it's one thing to recognize that there is an anthropogenic effect on the climate. I don't think anyone questions that our consumption of fossil fuels is having an effect on the climate. But it's a very different thing to reach the conclusion, which people do today, that we can predict that this is going to have a catastrophic kind of world-ending effect. That conclusion goes way beyond the evidence. And so the question is, if it's true that there's some anthropogenic effect on the climate, what should we do about that, or should we do anything about it? And if you look at the policies that people propose, I mean, people want us to completely cut out our use of fossil fuels. And if you look at I mean, just a little bit of research into how much we depend on, I mean, 80% of the world's energy comes from burning fossil fuels. And there are literally no realistic alternatives to that at present. So the idea that we can just cut that off and somehow continue to have a flourishing civilization is completely wrong. I mean, that cutting off, doing what sort of climate alarmists want us to do, and completely cutting off our use of fossil fuels, that would be a world-ending catastrophe that would, you know, bring harm to millions and billions of people around the world. So what's needed is a kind of more sober perspective on this issue. And the fact is that what you find in looking at the history of industrial development is the more freedom we have, the more industrialization we have, the safer and safer we become from risks of climate catastrophes. You know, look at how, I mean, you look at the number of people, even when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, which was a major disaster, the number of people who died from that, you know, was somewhere in the thousands. There are historical hurricanes of the same magnitude hitting much less developed countries where the death toll is like in the hundreds of thousands. So what we need to do is to maintain industrial capitalism, expand freedom, expand industrial development, continue using fossil fuels, and then we can protect ourselves from any risks that we face in the future. So that's what I would say about that. It's you know, the idea that we should, you know, have the UN tell the entire world how much energy we're supposed to use, you know, I don't think that's a good idea. So.
I had said in an earlier panel that I think environmentalism, and I'm putting the ism as an ideological approach, is really, really bad. And I think this, you have to see it at work in the climate change or the global warming issue. So there's certainly real science and real scientists involved in this issue, investigating it, and there's real knowledge. But when you get, so part of I think what Keith was saying is when you get the move from the science to policy, it's the ideologues take over. And environmentalism, when you look at the movement, where it came from is from socialism and the left. And if you read Ayn Rand's book, The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution, it's now called The Return of the Primitive, but it was the old title is The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution. And her analysis of how the left was changing, so how you go from the old left to the new left, is that you had a bunch of socialist, Marxist, communists, and they were entrenched in American universities, who promised, so prior to World War II, they were crusading idealists who promised that we have science on our side, we have progress on our side, communism and socialism is going to lead to prosperity. It led to no such thing. And by World War II, you could not give anyone the benefit of the doubt to think that when you see what happened in Russia, what you see what happened in Germany and with fascism and so on, which was nationalistic socialism, you could not give anyone the benefit of the doubt that this system produces any kind of progress. So they were faced with a choice to either re-examine their basic fundamental views. How could we have advocated for a system that is so monstrous? Or you could say now poverty is better than industry. So the Marxists used to be, we're going to industrialize the nation, Soviet Russia's going to surpass the US and so on. When nothing like that happened, you have a choice of we've committed to a monstrous ideal that we have to rethink, or now the ideal is going to be poverty. And her view was so many people were choosing the ideal now is poverty. So we can't get industrial civilization through socialism, communism. We're going to say industrial civilization is evil. And that is, this mindset is at work for 40, 50 years. And I think you see it in the global warming issue. If someone doesn't really, really think about all the benefits that industrial civilization brings, and that our proposals are saying let's not have these benefits because we're going to have a catastrophe with them. If you're not really, really thinking about what those benefits are, you're not thinking about the issue. And so many of them, from an ideological perspective, are not thinking about it because they don't like industrial capitalism. They want to get rid of it rather than thinking of it. It's one of the greatest achievements of mankind.
Só gostaria de complementar.
I just would like to add an information that might be necessary for the person who asked the question. If we searched for Kirchner's curve, you can also see a relationship between capitalism and development, even in the area of the environment. So it reaches a point of equilibrium, an inverted parabola, where capitalism develops and it could reach a peak of where maybe with damages to the environment, but after that point of development, the nation becomes aware of the damage and spontaneously reduces does a damage reduction because they become aware due to the development generated in the country, due to some cultural and knowledge issues. So maybe it would be interesting to look for Kirchner's curve. That the Cato Institute has studies related to that.
Let me just add one thing to that since you brought that up. The whole perspective that there's a conflict between, you know, quote, the environment and human development and human flourishing is a completely wrong perspective, and it comes from treating man as somehow separate from the environment. The environment is something to be left untouched. It's wilderness, and that's the good, and anything that we do, I mean, it really grows out this whole altruist perspective that we've been talking about this whole weekend. The idea that we are evil and that sacrifice is the good. Environmentalism grows out of that completely. If you put all that aside and you look at, I mean, what does industrial development do? It's all about improving man's environment, making our world better for us to live in. When we build, you know, skyscrapers and beautiful parks and cities and freeways, it's so that we can enjoy our world better. We have a better, even the Kuznets curve, you know, the idea that, well, things get bad and then the environment improves after we develop enough. I mean, the whole thing, the whole process of industrial development is a process of making man's environment better. So
first we develop ourselves, and then we develop what's around us. First of all, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to comment on the theory that was approached in a movie in 2005, Idiocracy, where society, basically it's what happens in the movie, society evolves up to a technological point where they have quality of life, high quality of life. So the young people don't care anymore about reason, rational thought and creating and developing, and then a mass devolves that controls the world, that is only concerned with fun, and they don't build anything anymore. So we think, how can we approach today, how can we bring the rational thought to education in a country like Brazil, to prevent having to deal every day with people that don't care anymore with the rational thought?
So I've seen the movie Idiocracy, and often I think it's a pretty funny movie, but when you take a step back and consider the issue that it's raising, it's not actually very funny. And in many ways, the premise of that movie is the same premise as Atlas Shrugged, except that Atlas Shrugged is treating the issue with dead seriousness. Because common to both is, well, what happens when the people who've invented the technology and discovered the science and who maintain the machinery are no longer there to keep it running, to keep it growing, to keep the world moving. And it's not a comedy anymore, really. It's a tragedy when that happens. And it's one that's happened in reality in the past. Onkar showed the graph earlier in the first presentation of the rise in GDP during the Greco-Roman period, and then it reverses for 1,000 years and doesn't start growing again until 18th, 19th century. And that's the exact same phenomenon. And what the Greeks and the Romans discovered tremendous amount of knowledge and created technology that was lost to the ages. But in the case of Greece and Rome, and in what's portrayed in Atlas Shrugged, it's not that the smart people stop having kids and that's why intelligence dies out in the world. For one thing, that implies that the only thing that is responsible for people's intelligent use of science and technology is genetics, and that's, for reasons we've discussed before, highly suspect. What happens instead is that people make choices, and they adopt ideologies. They adopt ideologies like altruism that end up sacrificing the best people to sacrificial furnaces, and often sacrificing themselves. That's why the mind then goes into retreat and goes into hiding if it's not destroyed, if the knowledge isn't lost to the ages. And so we're fortunate that we got it back as a result of the Enlightenment, but it's far from guaranteed that we'll keep it. And part of what we're here today to talk about is, well, what are the philosophical requirements of maintaining an industrial technological civilization? And a guy in a time machine is not going to be able to save us from President Camacho next time.
Yeah, I mean, the premise of the movie is funny, but it's not that it's an inevitable portrayal of what, it's an inevitable future. There have been periods in human history where people prized reason and they valued learning and development, and it's not this. I mean, I think you're right to see this kind of trend in today's world, and it's scary, but it's not inevitable, and it depends on the state of the culture. So,
I'll say a word about education, because you asked about education in Brazil, so I'm not familiar with the Brazilian system, but my guess is it's similar to what is going on around the world. I think, so there's a perspective you can have that people just aren't educated today, but I think the better perspective is that they're miseducated. So that it's not just that the education system doesn't teach them anything. It teaches them all kinds of things that are not true. And so Ayn Rand, and I think she was right about this, always emphasized that the battle for the culture is through the educational systems. And it's because the whole educational system is miseducating people. And to combat that, you have to really get into the sphere of education and combat the miseducation with actual truths and the whole method that's required to reach truths. So we had a panel yesterday about should people get involved in politics and so on. And there are reasons to do that. There are reasons upon reasons to get involved in the educational system if one is interested in the battle for the culture. I mean, it's part of why we're an educational institute, but many of the people who have gone through our programs and so on are working in the field of primary, secondary education. And I think that's really important because that, in the end, is where the battle has to be won.
Apenas antes da...
So before the next question, just using as a trigger, talking about education, how mandatory would be education for the parents to give the kids? What would be the developed system? We are not going to advocate for a state education. I don't know why Ayn Rand would think about this mandatority of having an education.
I'll say a word about this. I forget if she was asked this question specifically. There's some discussion of this kind of question a little more generally. But my view is that a parent has a responsibility to educate their child. And and I would make a distinction between educating in the sense of developing certain capacities that it can start to move towards independence versus any particular type of content. And specifically, I would think that a parent has a responsibility to teach the child to speak, language, and some rudimentary other capacities. I think it's really bad if that's all the parent did and then said, well, I couldn't care less about the rest of the child's education. And there would be, in a healthy society, all kinds of moral criticism of parents who don't educate their children and so on. But it would not be an issue for the state to intervene. But I think if you leave a child, you don't even teach them language and so on, there's an issue for the state intervening and saying this is abuse of the child.
And it's important that is an obligation of a parent, especially if it's one that the government has some role in enforcing, that is not an involuntarily assumed obligation. Parents chose to have children, and there are many options to prevent it from happening, and especially in a society where there are, they have to make the decision with the knowledge that they're going to incur responsibilities, and that's a choice on their part.
And I mean, on the issue of education more broadly, you know, a properly capitalist system would have a complete separation of state and education in the same way that you have a complete separation of state and every other aspect of the economy. You know, Ayn Rand often talked about separation of state and economics for the same reasons as separation of church and state, because the idea that the government is going to be involved in requirements about what people are allowed to think and controlling people, you know, controlling education and controlling people's thought is a recipe for growing authoritarianism and statism. So, yeah.
Próxima pergunta.
Good morning. My question is about language. For me, it's obvious when Ayn Rand has written about the man should do that and that. She's referring to mankind. 50 years have gone by, and I understand if there is a good philosophy to be shared, it should reach the new regenerations, and it makes a difference today. Not to change what she said, but the terminology, the way to reach the selfishness, what she wanted to say. There is not this bad connotation, but people would understand this as a negative thing. Maybe you should go for a new word. And I thought when I was seeing the principles, so the man should do that and that. No, you should think about mankind and should arrive to a new, should reach a new generation. That's something that's good. It's going to make a difference.
So I have some views on this, but I don't know if you're going to agree or disagree, so this could be interesting. And even in the way that you asked the question, the way the translation came through was, should you talk about man or should you talk about mankind? Well, in English at least, mankind is already is gendered as well. But I think I know what you're talking about.
What I say is that we don't have to use it. I can say in English. You can say person instead of man, because for a young girl, girls from 20 to 30, it makes a difference. If you put everything like man, we have here more men than women, but I'm not judging it. I mean, but we should try to get to issues that concern young people. Otherwise, if you stay, oh, she said that, that's the way, I'm not going to change. Sometimes you have to change the language to achieve your objective.
I get the question, and I have a view. I don't know how well thought out it is, but so the first thing to say is that for the most part, when Ayn Rand was talking about man's rights or man's life or the nature of man, she certainly intended to be speaking in a gender-neutral way. She was speaking about human nature. But there's a separate question of, is that the best word to use to refer to gender-neutral human nature? And in my own case, I don't have a problem with it. I certainly don't have the kind of feminist objections that are often offered to that kind of language. The feminist perspective is often people's thinking and their perception of reality is molded by their language, and so we need to make people use gender-neutral language to eliminate their sexual prejudices. I don't think that's where sexist prejudice comes from. Sexist prejudice comes from philosophical ideas that people adopt. It comes from various forms of determinism, according to which your genetics as a man or a woman it determines your intellectual or moral character, and the key criticism to make of that perspective is, no, people have free will whether they're man or woman. So I don't have the feminist objection. I think there are better, more productive ways to deal with sexist prejudice. But that's a lot to explain, what I just said right there, and you don't always get to explain it in conversation. And so even though I don't always object to using a man, I'll often just say human being so that there's no confusion, and I then read a passage from Ayn Rand, I might explain what she means if somebody thinks otherwise. So, I mean, there's definitely a use, I think, for more gender-neutral language when you don't have the time to explain the kinds of things I was just explaining. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that. Not to widen the question, but there's an interesting phenomenon so Ayn Rand is often attacked, often smeared. For people who are really interested in this issue, and I think it is a real issue of women having role models and not thinking that there's things that women can't do that men can do. This is a woman philosopher who's a genius in a field that has very few women in it. And she has novels that have some of the most interesting and powerful, independent, thoughtful, productive women characters. And that you wouldn't think, if you're concerned with this issue, that maybe we should promote Ayn Rand more and from this perspective. It's very interesting that this almost never happens.
We have been talking a lot about ideology. The questions are focused on the ideology, but it's not regardless, because we are battling for the ideological field of society and civilization organize itself the way the man sees himself, and he builds the society building on these ideas. Way today in Brazil, we have, in a general way, an ideology which is very altruistic. It's very difficult for you to receive political or popular support if you have a speech against a public university. And we have several people that position themselves as liberals, and they are in a situation where they have to choose between having or keeping an ideological discourse, which to say that you are against the public universities and they have to finish, that's what I think, or to defend or to try to reach the power, receiving more votes and making some concessions. And yeah, maybe the public university works and well, and we could make it feasible. My question is, where it's more important to keep the speech and focus on education or an ideology, and where do we have to comply with in order to arrive to the power? And then I want you to talk in this practical issue, the public universities. How do you understand that people that they think themselves liberal should, how they should position about these issues?
I want to just make sure I understand the question. It sounded like what you were asking was about politicians who are in a situation where they're asked to comment on the propriety of public education, especially higher education, and it seems like if they criticize it, they'll lose popularity, and should they then criticize it if there are other things they could still, other aspects of their agenda that they could advance by not commenting? Is that what the question was about?
Yeah, the question is exactly in this specific case, how you understand is the right position for an objectivist way of seeing it about public universities. It's publicly owned and free. So it's said it's free. We understand it's not free, okay? But it's said it's free. And no party in Brazil, no party at all, is against public university. Nobody position and say, I think that should end. Nobody is brave enough to say it. And that brings me to concern that we lost the ideological battle. No one is defending it, the correct idea. We are afraid of doing it. And perhaps they are right, because we maybe lose power if we do so. So we should choose, try to get votes, and try to, after getting votes, change the status quo, or should we try to sustain the speech and first get ideological influence in people?
I think this is similar to some of the issues we talked about yesterday on the panel about politics and getting involved in politics. So one of the things, so I think you should be for freedom in education and for privatizing it, and you should make this known as this is the political goal. And part of what we were talking about yesterday is it's important to really articulate what the end goal is, and if you're taking means to it. And there can be half measures and small steps and so on, but this is the vision. But you have to have a positive vision. So if all you have is, I'm against public universities, it can easily sound like you're against education. Well, I don't want people to be educated. Why do people need to be educated? So, no, the reason we're for freedom in education is because education is so valuable. So the idea, it's the same reason that I want freedom in medicine and so on. It's such a tremendous value that I want people free, able to think, able to innovate, able to compete, able to create, and able to produce. So if you position it not as, I'm against public universities, but I value education so much, and look at what now public universities are doing. They don't deliver on this. We could have such a vastly better system. And then give example, like Uber and Lyft versus taxi cabs. I mean, how much better is this kind of transportation and so on today? It's not, I'm against taxis. I'm against freedom in transportation so we can have this kind of innovation, this kind of progress and development. And if you do that, you'll win way more people over. Yeah, I like this, and I like Uber and Lyft. I use them all the time. Maybe education would be better. And it may be that they're not ready to say, like, let's get rid of all public education. But let's have some more freedom in education, and let's have some more competition, and maybe reduce the role of the state, so it makes it easier for private schools to operate and so on. So it's such an opportunity to present the positive vision, not I'm against education. And I think if you do that, you can win a lot of support for this cause.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but you also have to look at why is it so untouchable, and it's because of the dominance of altruism in the culture, right? If you know, people take it for granted that students have a right to free education provided by everybody else, and so you know, the more if you're looking for what are the battles you should fighting to completely change people's moral perspective is a much more fundamental issue, and advocating for a proper perspective on selfishness and a proper perspective on altruism and sacrifice, like we discussed yesterday. You know, that's really the battle that needs to be fought. The reason why you continue to have public education and socialism and all these things keep coming back is because of the moral ideas that people hold.
I'll add just one last thing to that, and this is not my area of expertise, but I also think, I mean, so the American system of education, especially, I'll comment on higher education, universities, since that's what you were asking about. The American system is increasingly dominated by the state. Even the universities that are nominally private are still largely funded through loans that are guaranteed by the federal government, for instance. But even then, it's still the students who are ultimately responsible for paying. And we talk separately about why prices are skyrocketing, and I think that's for the same reason they are in medicine, because of those loans. But I think it's not an accident that people from all over the world still come to American universities, and that they're considered some of the leading universities of the world. And I think it's important that their roots, at least, were as private institutions, and that they acquired a history of excellence and a reputation because of that. And I think that as government continues to entrench its support for even the private institutions, I think that American universities are losing their edge. And you see it all over the place with the various culture war battles in American campuses, where there's increasing restrictions on what you can say on campus and decreasing intellectual diversity. And that's, I think, often to the extent that government gets involved. And it will soon be the case that there's nothing special about American universities that attracts people from all over the world, I think.
We have time for two short questions. I'll try to be brief. First, I will not re-strengthen everything that I agree, restate everything that I agree with objectivism, because I think the idea here is to talk about our disagreements. So free will, egoism, the evilness of altruism, self-esteem, capitalism, free market, that's excellent, we agree. I have some points that objectivism, I need to make a parallel. Is objectivism as a philosophy and liberalism that for you is libertarianism, right? It's not, liberal means a different thing here in Brazil and in the United States. I have to do a economic comparison, especially after that great video of introduction to objectivism that you showed. She also presents capitalism and the function of state, a minimum state. I agree, I am a fan of Milton Friedman and follow this line of minimum and efficient state. Considering that we in our circumstances, our context, paraphrasing the philosopher Jose Ortega, today in our reality, do you consider moral to have an illegal attitude or conduct that justifies your worldview and philosophy? I think it's a rhetorical question. I think you don't believe in that, otherwise it would be the end of times. Because we live in a democracy, and the opposite of a democracy is authoritarianism. So living in a democracy, if we don't believe in the law that we are subject to, we need to enter the system to try to change the laws, or admit that democracy doesn't work and to advocate for a totalitarian regime. Based on that premise that if the objectivist does not desire a reality distant from what was shown before, where the minimum government is supported voluntarily, I think that we are far from it. We cannot deny that our reality today, in our context, that's impossible. Today, we are, especially in Brazil. Okay, what bothers me a little bit is that this ideal, even if I think it's valid, it ends up validating a little bit the thought of a large part of the right, especially the young people. Can you be a little bit more objective? All right, I'm sorry. It's that sentence, the tax is theft. I saw this in some t-shirt today, and I see that on social networks. Don't you think that theft would be to have a large, corrupt state, and that is theft, and that we should try to fight to diminish the size of the state and not to legitimize an illegal conduct of not paying taxes? And in summary, I think that would be, if it would be moral to disobey the laws. I think that's the question. To meet a goal or an objective that we believe in. I'm sorry if I made a mess.
Well, I don't think, well, first of all, in most countries it's illegal to advocate breaking the law, so I'm not going to do that. But is a question of if you think of taxation as a form of theft, what does that imply about how you should relate to the taxman? And I mean, I would say, first of all, that, I mean, the government is extremely powerful and you don't want to cross it on many kinds of issues where you don't have the practical means to evade it. And so, I mean, I think you should, and Ayn Rand herself paid her taxes, and she thought that was the right thing to do, all things considered, given the penalties that she would face if she didn't. Now, I don't think that she advocated that on moral principle. She advocated it in terms of this kind of short-term consequences. She did think that eventually a government should be funded voluntarily, and I think Yaron spoke about that and how it would work in his speech yesterday. But of course, that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon, and in the meantime, government is going to be funded through taxation. And I think you can even have the perspective that to the extent that we do need to have a government, given that there is no current alternative way of funding it, this is the fact that you have to accept. Now you can, again, as Onkar has specified, it's important to indicate and announce the ideal that you're working for. And so if you're working for an eventually voluntarily funded system, announce that and say, let's have the kind of tax system now that transitions us on the way. And so let's eliminate this kind of spending and that kind of spending first before we eliminate other kinds of spending. And there's also a separate issue of here of how do you deal with laws that you disagree with when you don't have the option, and is it ever proper to disobey the law? And I think that if I remember her views on this correctly, she did think that there is a role for civil disobedience, though not usually of the kind that you see celebrated. Her view is that you properly engage in civil disobedience when you want to make an issue of the justice of the law that you are disobeying. And so you need to be willing to be arrested, you need to be willing to go to trial, and then you need to be willing to engage in an argument for why you think this is an unjust law. But it's not the case of let's just all disobey whichever law we want and then not be held responsible for it. If there's a reason to do that, it's to try to change people's minds about the justice of the law. And I think that that in the best cases in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, that is exactly what some of the civil rights protesters were doing. And I think here of Rosa Parks, I think she was engaging in the right kind of civil disobedience. Not all of them did that, but there's anything to add?
I'll just say I agree with that, and I do not use the slogan or the idea that taxation is theft for the kind of reasons that I think were indicated in the question. I'd put it like this. So we've talked a bit in these last 2 days about government as a necessary good. I also view so related to that, any halfway decent government as a tremendous achievement. Life when you don't have anything close to objective form of government is really, really bad. And I've lived in places that you could call anarchistic, that there's nothing close to a monopoly on the use of force. So there's not a real government operating. And it's hand-to-mouth existence. So the idea, I don't like Denmark as a form of government, thinking of it as an ideal. But it is a real achievement to have this form of government, this kind of stability, this kind of political environment in which people can prosper. They can't prosper as greatly as they could under total laissez-faire capitalism. So that, I think, is the ideal, but it's still a tremendous achievement. And the idea of saying just taxation is theft is too easily translated into government is the problem. And it's not the problem. The problem is a wrong view of what government should be doing. And there's a vast difference between having the original American system of government with the idea that the goal of government is the protection of rights, and we have to tax in order to perform this function of government. And to think, no, the function of the government is to run people's lives, to give them free education and free healthcare, and to regulate business and so on. That's the problem, not that it's funded with taxes. And this is part of why Ayn Rand's view was the issue of how to finance a complete government in complete laissez-faire is a last kind of question. Because the whole crucial issue is what is the function of government? And when you get that and fully understand that, then there's issues, okay, how do we fund the government? But until you get people to think this is the right function of government, that is where the battle has to be fought.
Hi, my question is about philosophy. I will just define a term. Mercy, kindness shown towards someone whom you have the right or power to punish. Is there any room for mercy in Ayn Rand philosophy, or is there anything good about mercy?
Could you repeat the quotation? It was about mercy, but could you repeat the quotation?
Kindness shown towards someone whom you have the right or power to punish.
So that's a definition of mercy. Well, as you just defined it, kindness shown to one when you have the right to punish them. That amounts, I think, to a repudiation of justice. And Ayn Rand did think that justice was a crucial virtue. If someone is evil and you decide, who am I to judge? Turn the other cheek, love thine enemies, I'm going to show mercy. I hope you can see the way that that is expressed, and those half of those statements from the Sermon on the Mount. That traditional Christian view of mercy is, at its core, an expression of the altruist ethics. So when you're dealing with someone evil, self-interest demands justice. At the very least, it demands that you name the person as evil. It demands that you disassociate yourself from that person. And if you are a member of the criminal justice system and your job is to protect freedom, justice demands that a criminal who's been found guilty be punished. Now, there's mercies, I think, sometimes understood in different senses than that. And sometimes it's invoked when people think that a certain kind of punishment is disproportionate or excessive in relation to the actual crime, and they'll say, call for mercy. And there I think it's not a good thing to call it. Actually, that's also an issue of justice. So if someone is being, and you see this in the criminal justice system today with, I mean, best example would be drug laws that prohibit the use and trade in drugs, and you see what would otherwise be a peaceful activity, not a very productive one, but at least not infringing on anyone's rights, being punished as though it were, and being punished as a crime. And there I think justice calls for the end to those kinds of laws, and if the laws are going to be on the books, at least the sentencing should be different than what it is now, when there's violent criminals walking around who people should be going after instead.
In Objectivism, in Ayn Rand's thought, she makes a distinction that I think is an important distinction to make between mercy and forgiveness. So mercy is showing or is letting someone off the hook when they deserve to be punished. And she doesn't think there's a reason to do that. But you can forgive someone when it's earned. And it's important, that qualification. When someone has done things to make amends for the wrong action that they've taken, you still have cause. They did you harm. And you can never, in the end, make amends for when you treat someone unjustly. you've wasted a part of their life and they can never get it back. You can never make full amends if you've treated someone unjustly. But you can try to make amends, and it can be proper to forgive someone if they've earned it. But that's different. Mercy is unearned. The person's done nothing. He deserves to be punished or treated badly in some way, and you don't do it. And that, she's opposed to that. And there's a lot of this actually in Atlas Shrugged, and the difference between mercy and forgiveness, and what it would look like to earn forgiveness. And there's some startling things about that. So there's one, I won't try not to give away the story for people who haven't read it, but there's a character who's treated really, really, really unjustly by his family. And they're pleading with him at the end because he's turning his back on the family. Aren't you capable of forgiveness? And his attitude is, yes, I was, if you had earned it. And what he views as what was required for them to earn it isn't that high. But they don't even do that. So the story is about, I think Ben said this yesterday, Atlas is a lot about justice. And so it has issues about mercy and forgiveness in it. So if you're interested in Rand's view about this, that's what I would read. It's a long read, but it's a fun read. So.